Hello everybody. So in this video we're going to cover lesson planning in CLIL or lesson planning for the CLIL TKT test and what we need to know to be successful in the test when it comes to the topic of lesson planning or planning lessons. So let us begin with making the difference or establishing differences between what goals, objectives, and outcomes, specifically learning outcomes are. So based on this graph or picture of an inverted triangle, we can see that as we go down from goals to objectives and all the way to outcomes, we get more and more specific, right? Goals are broader, objectives are more specific than goals, but less specific than outcomes, and outcomes are more specific than both objectives and goals. So as we go down the triangle, the level of specificity gets higher, right? That's the idea. So let's see some examples here. So if I'm teaching a class on social media, I could have as a goal that my students will learn about media manipulation. So manipulation in general, that's a very broad goal. Now, if I'm making this an objective, and objectives can be phrased from the perspective of the teacher or from the perspective of the students. One example could be students will understand the impacts of social media on teenagers. Again, more specific than the first one, but still a little broad. If I want to get even more specific, I could say, for example, as an outcome, students will assess how social media posts use language to manipulate teenagers. So notice the level of specificity. Now I'm talking about manipulation of teenagers by using social media, not the impacts in general. I'm talking about one specific type of impact. And that's how the outcome differs from the objective. And the objective differs from the outcome in that it adds social media as a more specific element, and it adds teenagers as the target here, right, of that impact. So notice how clear we get as we go down the list. So let's see, again, the differences between teaching objectives and learning outcomes. Now, or sometimes teaching objectives are also called learning objectives. So I'm putting those names here because you'll see them differently expressed in the literature. So when I, as a teacher, write an objective, I'm talking about what I intend to teach. So they are specific in that they're more specific than the goal, but they're less specific than the outcome itself. They can be instructor-centered or student-centered. So I can say, the teacher will teach the impacts and effects of social media, or students will understand the impacts and effects of social media, etc. And of course, my objectives are part of the path or a bridge to producing my learning outcome. So, because when I'm writing my learning outcomes, I'm describing the expectations to students. What are students supposed to learn and be able to do, right? So for me as a teacher, it helps me fine-tune my teaching strategies, fine-tune what I'm going to teach. But this is really seen from the perspective of students. And of course, it'll help me as a teacher assess my students more appropriately because I'm being more specific about what it is I'm teaching. And from a student's perspective, it helps them track their progress and plan for whatever type of assessment they'll have to face. Okay, again, some examples here of an objective. Students will understand the impacts and effects of social media on teenage behavior. And then as a learning outcome, I have the phrase, students will be able to assess how social media posts use language to manipulate teenagers. And that's actually not a phrase, that's a sentence. So let's see some examples of learning outcomes by subject, because when you talk about CLIL, we're not talking about just language, we're talking about content areas that are being taught through a target language. In this case, which interests us for the TKT CLIL test, we're talking about English. So literature, students will be able to identify examples of symbolism, again specific, in stories, very specific, and use it in their own writing. An example of a history learning outcome. Students will be able to analyze how American immigration history relates to current trends in American policy. Again, immigration history, American policy. Those are the elements that ground my learning outcome. And if I'm teaching first aid, which is related to science, students will be able to demonstrate the 4 steps used to administer CPR. Again, 4 steps, CPR. Those are the elements that help me ground here, or ground my learning outcome. And when I'm talking about writing lesson plans, I also have to mention differentiation and support, 2 major concepts in the TKT CLIL test. Because it's important to establish this difference in light of the fact that differentiation is a type of support. So what is the main difference between them? Or am I talking about the same thing? So when I say differentiation, I'm basically talking about adjusting content to students who are more capable or less capable within that outcome or target, or whatever it is that I'm learning. That they're learning and I'm teaching. So, and when we talk about differentiation, I can differentiate input, the content itself, or the output, what the students will produce. So let me see some examples here. I can differentiate by pairing students. So for example, a student who's struggling with a more able peer, a student who knows a little better, or I can limit or focus my samples. I can limit my samples or the focus of my lesson. So if I have a broad focus, I can have a more narrow focus, and then another narrow focus following, another narrow focus following. So I can adjust the content and limit it so that students can progress more easily. I can provide question starters to help my students ask questions. I can provide sentence frames if I'm asking them to produce sentences, or if I'm having them produce sentences. And those are examples of differentiation. And support is a more broad term. I can offer support before, during, and after a lesson. And despite differentiation needs, I should always provide support to my students, or be ready to provide it if they need it. So some examples: if I'm teaching a text that is too difficult, I can, before the lesson, add visuals and diagrams to help them understand, or I can present information in different ways to help different types of students see the information again and again, or in the format that they're more sensitive to or more open to. And during the lesson, I can also paraphrase information. I can use a glossary, I can use synonyms, because by doing all of this, I'm offering support to my students. So those are different ways of differentiating and of providing support. And some CLIL resources that we always offer that served as source texts for the information here. I would start from the middle, the TKT course, the TKT CLIL course module. Very useful book for preparing for the TKT course. And to its right, I would mention the TKT Handbook for Teachers, TKT CLIL Handbook for Teachers. And the other 3 texts that are to the right or to the left of these are books. They're very good sources for understanding the general concepts and content that the test will focus on. So I hope you have found this useful, and I see you in the next video. Bye-bye.